we are going to do an interview with Wyatt Reed. For those of you who don't know who Wyatt Reed is an American journalist. He has been reporting protests and everything that has been going on in America right now. And we're going to do an interview about the ongoing discussions, and so basically we're going to get a report of what's happening. All right, so Mr. Reed, okay, wait. So can you explain to us what's happening right now in America? Are the protests still going on?
Yes, the protests are still going on in a number of cities. The specific state of the protests really depends on the city. In many cities, especially Minneapolis, the protests are ongoing and have maintained their militant character and are fully separate from the state, from the powerful political parties, from the Democrats and the Republicans. In other cities, it's a little less clear if they've been able to maintain that sort of distinction. For example, here in Washington, D.C., where I'm based, we saw rather quickly after a few nights of extremely militant protest and really actions that more or less developed in many ways into sort of street battles between outraged young black youth and police force. So the first few nights, we're seeing really something I don't think Washington, D.C. has seen in 50 years, if ever, which was, again, youth rising spontaneously up in defiance and in opposition to these loathed police figures who, for years have been terrorizing black communities in Washington, D.C., doing what's called jump outs, where you can just be walking alone in your neighborhood. All of a sudden, a van of police pulls up. All these guys, heavily armed, SWAT gear, jump out, go through your pockets, see what you're doing, rough you up a little bit. Absolutely no concern for, the supposed constitutional rights that people in this country are supposed to enjoy. So there's long-standing tensions here within the oppressed communities of Washington, D.C. Against this police force that is rightfully so, in my opinion, seen as kind of an occupying force. So when we see 2 weeks ago these protests take off in Minneapolis, and the parallel protests the day after or 2 days after develop in cities across the country, in New York and Los Angeles, here in Washington, D.C., and Atlanta and Chicago, we had really an extremely potent moment, and still in many cities obviously do. Here in D.C., the Democratic Party has largely been successful in co-opting the energy around the anti-police protests. So for the first few nights, as it's basically bricks are coming from one side, and tear gas canisters are coming from the other, and I'm getting hit. I got hit with it's called a pepper ball. It's essentially it's a chemical weapon, and if somebody if, for example, Bashir al-Assad were to have fired this at some particular moment, and it got, somewhere in the vicinity of some jihadist in Syria, we would see headlines about the chemical weapons being unleashed. All of a sudden, when they're being unleashed on civilians in the seat of power in Washington, D.C., we have a whole national dialogue about, is this even real tear gas or not? And the Park Police spent, the better part of a weekend after Donald Trump's sort of infamous photo op denying that they'd used tear gas at all. And it was only after a local news channel Channel 9 collected the actual spent tear gas canisters and noted that they were warm to the touch when they picked them up. That, you know, we ultimately saw the park police admit that they were wrong, say they had made a mistake. This is the tactics and sort of strategy that we're seeing across the country. The police attacking, maiming, assaulting people, brutalizing them, outright lying about it. You know, for example, this 75-year-old man in Buffalo, New York, who was shoved to the ground and immediately started bleeding out the back of his skull by Buffalo Police Department. And then they released a statement within hours saying that he tripped and fell. So this is kind of the broader pattern that we're seeing develop here in the United States. And just returning very quickly to Washington, D.C., the kind of militant energy that we saw, which was what I was trying to originally refer to, at this point now, the local Democrats, Mayor Muriel Bowser, chief among them, and also a number of Democratic Party operatives and strategists have essentially been attempting to, since Donald Trump's, you know, ill-fated photo op and his decision to activate the troops to bring in U.S. soldiers to patrol the streets, the Democratic Party is now rather successfully portraying this as the people versus Trump battle, instead of, as it was originally, a bunch of extremely upset, pissed off local black youth saying "fuck 12," you know, and that means fuck the police, right? That's what it was the first 2-3 nights. It was fuck 12, fuck 12, fuck 12. We do not fuck with these police. We want them out of our communities yesterday. And all of a sudden now it's fuck Trump, fuck Trump, fuck Trump. The Democrats are printing out signs that say bunker bitch, turning this into, you know, because Donald Trump was, you know, hiding in the bunker. Now it's like an indictment of like, oh, Donald Trump's not strong enough to stand up. You know, it's like, good. You know, I'm glad that, from the perspective of someone who wants to see radical revolutionary change in this country, I would think that it would be a good thing to have, you know, your enemies scared. But in this case, you know, they would rather have a president that isn't scared of the police, that isn't scared of the people rising up against them. Yes. That's, you know, the kind of message that this sends. So there's a lot of attempts to confuse, to distort, and redirect the powerful popular energy that people are feeling right now back into the two-party system, into getting people to vote for Joe Biden.
Right. Thank you for a detailed answer. So, and what we've seen in media is basically, yes, it started in Minneapolis, but then it quickly basically struck a lot of new protests in different cities in America. But more than that, even right now, what we're seeing is protests after protests worldwide, in Australia, in UK, and in some cities of Europe too, which kind of shows the reaction of people not only in America but worldwide towards the black. So I want to touch the specific demands of the protests right now in America. What is the popular demand among protesters? What do they want, and what they do? What are the main highlights of the slogans that they've been using the past 2 weeks?
Yeah. So this is, you know, a good question, and there's a lot to get into here, partly because the protests have been fairly ambiguous. And so right at the beginning, you know, as I was saying, there were very few coherent demands beyond fuck the police. And that in and of itself, though, to me is more or less a demand, right? We want less police. If nothing else, less police, maybe get rid of them completely. That is, still, you know,
very ambiguous, right?
Very ambiguous, because we're not looking at something that was created by any one specific organization or anything, right? We're seeing a largely spontaneous reaction, not just to the police murder of George Floyd, but to the killing of Breonna Taylor, the failure to indict police for any of this, let alone, having, removing them from the force. So we're seeing basically the development ideologically of a number of people away from the system, because within the two-party system, there has historically been no room for this kind of fucked up police mentality. Now we're seeing an opening of the space within the Democratic Party as they tail the popular movements, which is largely what the Democratic Party exists to do, is take the demands of the people, water them down 90%, and try to sell them back to them. So that's the stage we're in now, where the Democratic leadership is unveiling today this bill attempting to, revamp, overhaul, reform the police. A lot of it, some aspects of it sounded halfway reasonable. I have to go look at the specifics here again. There was a provision that would bar the use of no-knock warrants for drug cases, and that was the specific way that Breonna Taylor was murdered by police in Louisville, Kentucky. So these no-knock warrants essentially mean that the police can show up to your house at 4 a.m, not announce themselves as police, break down your door, and if you try to defend yourself, you are all of a sudden killing a police officer and likely to get the death sentence. So this is super dangerous for a number of reasons, that that the cops were ever doing it at all. The fact that they would end it, that's a good start. But then you see more provisions about banning chokeholds, right? And this to me is always kind of a giveaway about they're not serious when they talk about banning chokeholds. They're blowing hot air, right? They're blowing smoke at it. Because if you look at police departments across the country, for example, New York Police Department, I believe, has had a rule on the books since 1993 preventing them from using chokeholds. It's been 27 years, and apparently they haven't found out about it yet. So, as long as we're having, just these kind of like suggestions that the police maybe start to try to follow the rules, please. It's kind of like, well, people are done asking, people are telling. And this is what we're seeing now with the statues. It's one of these things that really the people don't control very much in the global north and in the centers of imperialism. The oppressed peoples do not control the chambers of power. But the one thing that we do have control over is sort of our environment. And people are waking up to the fact that we can. We've got this 17th century slaver who's been polluting our city for decades and decades, and we don't want him here. Let's just throw him in the river. As simple as that. Exactly. And so obviously that's not going to lead necessarily directly to any real shift in the conditions of the working class. But it does open up, I think, a space ideologically for people to realize the power of collective action, and also for people to realize that we push the state to action. The state will respond, and if it doesn't, then we just do it anyway, and then we'll deal with the consequences at that point in time. And that is an important leap to make mentally. That's a big jump to say, what? We are willing now to put ourselves in opposition to the state and potentially be arrested, face the consequences. But there's just so many of us, it's like, how are you even going to charge anyone that's in that crowd? You can't really tell who's doing anything. Right. If they want to try people, I think that would be great. I think that would be a big victory for all of those people to have to bring this out at trial and go over the fact that, this statue that nobody even wants is, somehow some sacred part of history. And this is, what the government thinks. by all means, I think, go ahead and try to charge people and sort of expose yourselves for who you are.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So, well, as you mentioned, the two-party system does not allow these kinds of discussions. So it's either red or black, right? Either Democrat or Republican. So, but apart from the political position, the political situation in America, what about the economic crisis, the unemployment, the poverty? What are the impacts of these kind of factors on the current ongoing protests?
It's difficult to overstate them because in much of the global north, people received checks on a weekly or a monthly basis. I think in Canada is kind of $2,000 a month. In the United States, working people got $1,200 once a few months ago, if that. So we now have 40 million people out of work at least from this close. I saw the numbers. It's something between 1 in 5 and 1 in 7 people, has lost their work because of the coronavirus. And most of them, those jobs aren't coming back. This isn't, this is a major game changer for the long term in terms of what it's like to live in the United States of America. Because I don't think we're ever really going to turn back from this. Especially now that, instead of seeing a real coherent response from the ruling class to understand that for their own economic long-term benefit, they would have to seriously address COVID-19 and prevent their workforce from basically and their consumers, right? Their consumer base from going bankrupt and no longer being able to purchase the commodities by which the entire system functions. There has been a break in this chain, and things are not working like they're supposed to. And unless there is a serious attempt to subsidize the economy via these kinds of like universal basic income sort of measures, the system is just not going to work. So what we're seeing in terms of the looting, quote unquote, and the rioting, quote unquote, it's hard to overstate the impact of 2 to 3 months of deprivation. People can't even get on unemployment because the systems in every state are backed up for weeks. There's no money coming out. The system, it's really hard to overstate.
Exactly.
When the whole thing crumbles or rather crushes kind of to a halt, people get desperate. And especially, in a country that's as materialistic, as motivated by consumer goods, as status symbols, or really just ways to demonstrate your social ranking. It's not hard to understand why people would steal some nice things. You know what I mean? Everything about who you get to hang out with, how you get to act, who you get to sleep with. All these things are kind of caught up in what kind of lifestyle you were seen as having. So it's not difficult for me to think about somebody has the opportunity to get some really nice stuff. Yeah, they're probably going to take it because they don't know when they may never have an opportunity like that again. They don't have any money coming in. They don't have health insurance. They don't have so many of the bare necessities that a quote unquote civilized government would provide to its people. People don't get that here. So the deprivation that working class people have been feeling, not just from the Republicans but from the Democrats too, can't be overstated.
Yep, exactly. So one thing that we should probably talk about well, as to this, to some extent, disambiguate the demands. So there are currently ongoing discussions about defunding the police reforms, and we've seen a lot of response from police officers, and it's all over the media how the police are responding. As you've mentioned, the tear gas, the what did you say? The bullets,
pepper balls, and they're using steel
yeah.
bullets too, rubber-coated steel bullets as well. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Right. So these are the kind of protests, and what we're seeing is basically these protests will continue, right? And so what will be the current ongoing discussions about what do we want, right? So what is the correct contents of defunding the police, or maybe police reforms? Will that solve the problem? And how will the problem be solved, or at least attempted to be solved, by these kind of ideas or approaches?
Yeah, another important question, and another one that's difficult to answer right now, just because these conversations are happening as we speak. And I'm looking to Minneapolis really for kind of the model of how these protests could go, because I'm not sure if you saw this video that came out this weekend of the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, coming out to an assembly, tens of thousands of people. And it's mostly organized, as far as I'm aware, by this group called Black Visions Collective in Minneapolis. That's been kind of at the forefront of helping organize and make these spontaneous uprisings into something a little bit more coherent and long-lasting. And so they were holding court in the city. This, to me, is powerful. They're saying, we don't need to have a public hearing. We don't need to go through the government, through their channels of power, where we all sit in a nice little room boxed in, and I want to make a comment. Please let me talk. Ooh, please, Mr. Officer,
right?
Or just like a city council meeting or something. Where maybe I get to make my public comment if I stand in line and I check all the little boxes, and then the police officer lets me talk. People are saying, no, we're having our own.
Let's ditch it, and then let's get to the real talk.
Right. And so that's why we see the mayor of Minneapolis coming out in what I think was a pretty big political mistake for him and for the system, and essentially being judged by tens of thousands of his constituents on their own terms in a people's power assembly, in which the people control the narrative, they control the flow of events, they control the message, the discussion, they dictate the terms of the conversation. That is so important to replicate everywhere we can. For us to be creating outside the boundaries of traditional politics our own vehicle for revolutionary change in this country, that's what every protest should look like. Unfortunately, again, in other cities, we've seen these attempts to co-opt them, the protests, by the establishment itself. We see people coming in and they're recorded, physically grabbing, some old anarchist who's like smashing bricks, and 4 or 5 of them, basically carrying him over directly to the police and turning him in. Those people may not have badges, but they're cops. They are police. They are police collaborators. They are attempting to defang the movement for the police so that the police don't have to be seen doing it. And that's really what is driving all this change, right? Is the police repression of the protest. So if you can get, movement leaders within the procession itself to carry out the repressive work of the government, then you don't need to be seen dirtying your hands doing it. And it completely neutralizes whatever sort of propaganda effect would come out of being seen brutalizing working people standing up against racist police terror. So that is kind of a trend that we have to be concerned with. In terms of what actually disbanding or abolishing or defunding the police means and looks like, that's still has yet to be hashed out. So we see in Minneapolis today a super majority or a veto-proof majority of city council members in Minneapolis, which means they don't need permission from the mayor who said he doesn't want to defund the police. Yes. They have enough city council members that they can just do it without him. But what the Black Visions Collective has made clear is that in order to continue to dictate the terms of this whole conversation, people need to stay out in the streets. If as soon as people like back away, you know, and decide like, oh, we won, this is it, it's over, we did it, you know, the city council said that they are going to abolish the police. Well, then they're going to, you know, they're gonna do whatever it is that is the path of least resistance. That is going to create the least amount of problems from their sponsors within the ruling class, and the least amount of resistance within their actual constituents. So, you know, from the perspective of a revolutionary, right now is the time not to let up, but to keep the pressure on, keep their feet to the fire, and keep driving this conversation so that those who are negotiating now on behalf of the people themselves, right, have this massive movement that they can point to and say, you know what, I don't really care if you don't want to defund the police. These people are not going to leave until you do. You know, that is how the working class needs to be engaging with the ruling class now on our own terms, not within their systems, not within their traps that they've laid out to try to neutralize this revolutionary energy. It's got to be within the framework of a working class revolution.
Yeah, it's good that we touched the revolutionary part of the whole story, because I think this should not die out, and I'm gonna basically read the slogans that have been used in the process, basically in the last week after the whole protest got more and more political, right? So what's the optimal course of action would be to organize, strike, and then pressure. So which is in line with what you've said, right? Pressuring and then not backing away. And in light of that, I should mention that recent researchers in America point out that more than 50% of young people in America look positively on socialism. And in this context, when you look at the actions, do you see the tendency to turn the whole system into, to organize anti-capitalist action? And do the young people that I mentioned in America have this kind of revolutionary energy to pursue that quest?
Well, a couple weeks ago, I would have given you a different answer. A couple weeks ago, I would have said that I wouldn't make too much of that kind of poll because what a lot of young people mean when they say socialism isn't really what most socialists, actual socialists from the global South mean when they say socialism. I would say that a lot more of those people have kind of a Bernie Sanders, quote unquote, Scandinavian socialist or Nordic, socialist model in mind. But now I think that it's a big deal, and it's an interesting question, right? Why after 80 years of super intensive Cold War propaganda against socialism, against communism, is this new generation open to this concept? And it's partly because, after capitalist restoration in the USSR, there was no, the ruling elites had the concept that China was liberalizing, was going to essentially turn into a capitalist country, and they had it in their mind, the end of history, right?
Right.
So they transitioned away from demonizing socialism to demonizing terrorism to demonizing Arabs and Muslims. So we see basically this space open up where the anti-communist propaganda project in this country, it's powerful, but it's kind of a paper tiger, and it's something that they would have had to have been watering a little bit more than they were all those years, and it became this reliable sort of specter that they used to be able to just trot out anytime somebody is proposing some radical change, and it's like, oh, he's a socialist, and oh my God, all of a sudden the magic words don't work anymore.
Yeah.
You say socialism and everyone's like, huh, oh, okay, that sounds kind of cool. And so that's what I attribute. I attribute the openness of the next generations to socialism less to like a real coherent understanding of what socialism actually looks like in terms of like a dictatorship of the proletariat, and more in terms of, oh, that's a thing that people have lied to me about that actually seems to mean good things, So right now it's a big moment for socialists in this country, and in fact, the Party for Socialism and Liberation led a 100,000 person march through Philadelphia this weekend, and I encourage your viewers to check out clips of one of their leaders, Eugene Puryear, giving a fantastic speech, essentially laying out what socialism actually looks like, to working people in Philadelphia, a city where that group has significant ties and has been doing a ton of really important work throughout the pandemic to make sure that the most vulnerable communities in that city have access to food and supplies during the stay-at-home orders. So I think that that kind of provides a model for how socialists need to be operating now, in terms of kind of building dual power within the communities that we are a part of. That to me, that's the future right there, is providing for the people, because the government is clearly decided not to, is providing for the people and then providing them an organized outlet for them to see essentially what it is that their community needs, and then how to get there. Or rather, most people don't need to know. You don't need any convincing what their community needs. What they need convincing is how do we enact these policies that we need so desperately. And that's, to me, I think the only way that we get there is through a socialist sort of vanguard party of working people.
That's a great answer. Thank you a lot. Thank you a lot for the interview. Maybe you should mention the kinds of work that you're doing, the podcasts, and your work in basically media for those of people who want to listen more to what you said and get more information.
Yeah. So you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is @WyattReed13. And I also produce a radio show on Radio Sputnik called By Any Means Necessary. We are always discussing like important political situations. On Friday, we had the Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza. Today, we spoke with a journalist in Bolivia explaining the Bolivian quote unquote voter fraud. We're always discussing basically what imperialism is, and we're giving a sort of a by any means necessary, the famous words of Malcolm X. So our hosts are Black. They're talking about Black issues in America. It's an important show to listen to, especially now if you want to get a sense for the kinds of demands and strategic sort of ways of thinking that our revolutionary organizers in this country have and are trying to put forward. Check us out by any means necessary on Radio Sputnik. And yeah, follow me on Twitter, WyattReed13. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to break down these important issues.
And I mean, we thank you for your time. All right, so this was our interview with Wyatt Reed. We will come back with